Hello, makers. Welcome to Making Conversation, a podcast where we celebrate all things making. We're back, baby. I decided that we were going to take a little time off. We were going to enjoy summer. We were going to get outside. We were going to soak up the sun. We're just going to have some fall episodes now, and they're all going to be great. A lot of these episodes that are coming up are going to be related to flock. So we were... Hi. You want to be a part of the podcast? We were fortunate enough to work with Jess again this year and do some live interviews at Flock Fiber Festival. Of course, I recorded them, and of course, we had technical difficulties with the only microphone that we didn't test. So that's fun. But we are going to jump in and re-record some stuff. We are also recording some episodes with people who I just didn't have like the time, physical time in the day to sit down at Flock because so many people were interested in chatting for the podcast, which was so awesome. Before we jump into today's episode, I do want to address very quickly, maybe a small elephant in the room, my eye. Let's just say the recordings that you're about to watch, that was the last day that my eye was normal. I am okay. I am healing. It ended up being a soft tissue infection. It's now a new fear unlocked for me and many of my friends. It's bad luck. It has nothing to do with hand washing. It just can happen. So I hope that none of you ever have to deal with this and be hospitalized for 11 days. But I just wanted to point that out because you know, if you've been around for a while, that I feel like it's fairly obvious that it's different. So today's episode is real cute. First, we're going to talk about cashmere goats. So cute. Then we're going to chat with somebody who knitted their own wedding dress. I mean, what? It's just the talent, right? First, I had the very huge pleasure of sitting down with Amy Swanson, who is the director of June Cashmere. And we go into all about the story of the goats that they use for their cashmere yarn. You get a little history, you get some cute goat photos. You'll learn something new, I can guarantee it. Amy is out of Columbus, Ohio. She used to teach Spanish at university and then one day was like, I need to be doing something in the maker field. Without further ado, Amy Swanson. Let's start, as we always do on this podcast. Tell us about your maker story. Where did everything begin?
I grew up in a family of makers. So my dad was a beautiful carpenter. I had 3 older sisters and they sewed. And I remember, being like this, watching. and I found, when your mom cleans out the attic and gives you stuff.
Yeah.
In these things I went through, there were me drawing Barbie doll outfits, designing outfits. And that's how I learned to sew. I started to make Barbie outfits first and then knit. I learned to knit. In fact, I thought you'd ask me this question. So I'm like, here was my first knitting. It was 4-H. Here is some bright orange first place 4-H swatches.
I love it. You still have it. When we were chatting over email, because, I really wanted to talk with as many vendors from Flock as possible.
Yeah,
but, I am one human and there are only so many hours in the day.
Yes.
The response that you had when we had reached out to the vendors and asked who might be interested in chatting was just so passionate about everything that y'all are doing. And it really stuck out to me. And I definitely wanted to have a conversation with you. So let's jump into more of the June Cashmere story. How did your work start with the shepherds in Kyrgyzstan?
That all started with our founder, Cy Belahovic, but it really has to do with history.
Mm-hmm.
So let me back up just a bit.
I love a good history lesson. Let's go.
Yes. Well, that's why this is such a passionate story because of everything that comes together in this story. So Kyrgyzstan used to be part of the textile producing region of the Soviet Union. And interestingly, I think it was World War I, the Soviets moved all the textile infrastructure over to Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan to get them out of the war. So protect them. Mm-hmm. But that created a century of textile production in Kyrgyzstan. So the shepherds up until the Soviet time, were always nomadic, lived nomadic lives, but they became semi-nomadic in that time. And because the Soviets had them establish towns. By semi-nomadic, that means that they live in towns now, but there are still many that spend the summer with the animals up in the yurts and still do all of that shepherding. What happened was then shepherds had an outlet for fiber. There was like wool specific fiber, goat fiber, fiber that went to state-run mills, and then that employed thousands of people, and then the outlet to the larger Soviet Union for sales. All of that collapsed when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Kyrgyzstan became landlocked, so then you lost your market. Then the mills became privatized, and when they became privatized, then everything got sold off. And then when everything got sold off, there was no place for shepherds to sell their fiber. So since 1991, entities like the World Bank, had been looking for ways to help Kyrgyzstan revitalize their economy and kept trying to look toward this textile history. And, you couldn't go to the wool, because if you did wool, it's just way too heavy and way too expensive to export, because now you no longer have mills that can mill it into yarn. So you can't export it to mill it into something, because you don't get enough financial return. So you would lose money before you even begin. So the cashmere portion comes in. So people are hunting for, ways to help revitalize this economy. In 2008, there's a researcher. Her name is Carol Curvin. She's out of England, and she works with animals and livestock and crops in countries. And she was working in, I think it was Uzbekistan, which was right next door. And she had Scotland's world premier cashmere developer. He was a scientist. He was with her, and he saw a goat, and he asked, could he part the outer hair? And when he did, he turned to Carol and said, "Did you know you have cashmere goats here? You know what? I have a map. If Kyrgyzstan
I love this.
So now,
okay, hold on. In true educator fashion, let me pull out my map. I love it.
If Kazakhstan is to the north, Russia is to the north of that, but China is to the east, China and Mongolia. And so if we know that, the finest cashmere in the world comes out of China and Mongolia, even though it's been very problematic, it makes perfect sense to think that there would have been cashmere producing goats in Kyrgyzstan, but they didn't even have a word for that. Shepherds do not have a tradition of working with cashmere. And during Soviet times, there was a systematic program of crossbreeding to bring in larger goats, like a Don goat or an Angora goat. So you'd get a very different long-haired fiber. I have more pictures.
Oh, please.
You got this guy. So he is a crossbred goat. And then you got this fiber that could be used. But mostly, this is a country that uses meat and dairy. And so they wanted a larger goat. But Kyrgyzstan is very mountainous. And to the south, bring back that map. To the south is these 20,000-foot mountains. And in fact, if you run through this way, you run right through the area where Tsai began working, our founder. And this was part of the Silk Road. And so these mountains are like 20,000-foot mountains. Well, so then this researcher, Carol, started to go into this southern part. And basically the mountains stopped this crossbreeding program. And they found these native goats. And when they did the research and they found that the goats had cashmere that was on par and could be, if there was work with shepherds, to that in Mongolia and China. So you see the difference in the goats, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then this is what the native goat looks like. And his outer coat is necessary for, the cold and all that. But it's that downy undercoat that grows for winter months. And a goat only produces about 4 ounces. So it's a very precious commodity. You lose up to 40% or more in weight during the processing. So it takes at least 4 goats to get enough for a sweater. And you can compare that to a sheep where you could get, 4 sweaters out of a single sheep.
Wow.
So that's why it's expensive, right? So it's remote. Chinese had discovered that had discovered these goats and had been coming in and shearing and paying shepherds very little. And there was a middleman involved. So the middleman got a whole lot more money than the shepherds. And so what Carol Curvin did, along with a Kyrgyz colleague, Xavier is his first name, Togunbayev, I think is his last name. They put on a conference, and Sai attended this conference, and they said, we're trying to help develop the Kyrgyz Cashmere. We need someone who's interested in purchasing from them, who will pay them fair value. This is all about training shepherds about what they have, teaching them about good, husbandry practices, how to collect fiber. So we don't want to shear. That's problematic. One of my favorite stories is that when they first started to go to the villages to work with shepherds, they'd say, "Oh, have you heard about combing for fiber collection?" And an older woman said, "Oh, I think I remember that from the Soviet days." And she went and she pulled out a comb that had been fashioned from the spring of an old car seat. So this is what the combs look like today. And you can kind of visualize, right? The spring.
Yeah.
What strikes me about that story, and of course my background, is that look how quickly knowledge is lost. So this older woman remembering from Soviet days, and here we are then like in 2010-ish, and that knowledge is lost. And so Sinus team developed, these are made in Kyrgyzstan, these are what the shepherds use, developed combs. And their initial work was with about 250 villages and about 1,200 families. And a family owns like about 10 goats. So if you are concerned with cashmere and out of China, Mongolia, where there had been over land overuse, so land desertification and problems that way, which I believe they've been working on. Those are thousands and thousands of animals per sort of land unit. And in this region, you don't have that at all. I mean, the animals are so many fewer per land unit that there really isn't the concern that way. So what Sai did then was he was already trying to find a way to work in economic development, and he's established a network with Kyrgyz people, employees, and who would go and purchase from shepherds. I have a picture where they go, here's a picture where they're combing. Here where they're purchasing, and so they're weighing the cashmere and they're looking at it for quality. So we established like a 3-tier system that would reward better than average quality, but paying them fair market value. It's a necessary secondary income for people who really lost sort of this outlet, and does really good things for them. So like I said, that work Sai established, and then he established the yarn line as a way for the outlet of sales. And then he was only a couple of years in, and what he found out was you have to put the cashmere through specialized equipment because you have that outer hair that I showed you. That is not cashmere, that long outer hair. But when you comb, or when you're going to have some of that outer hair in, and you only want cashmere left. So you put it through equipment called dehairing equipment. And it became clear that Sai needed to establish a dehairing facility in Kyrgyzstan. So that is what he has gone on to do. And we worked together. He did establish the dehairing facility, which also was put on pause because of COVID. And that's up and running for almost 2 years now. Allows him to work with more shepherds, for them to expand, for them to work with more fibers. We're going to be getting camel in, so I'm waiting very excitedly. It's ready to be plied, and I've heard it's beautiful, and so it's a very, very exciting thing that does really good work. And when Sai took it to be milled, he really did his research. He went to England, where they have a tradition of milling cashmere so it will last. And so what we found, this is a garment I've made, but what we found is that, you can rub and rub and rub and it doesn't pill. He sends the longest most uniform fibers of a fiber that's already very short. And that makes a difference. And then the way that it's pilled and plied, what we get and what he developed is just a beautiful drapey yarn that really is so durable. And so my passion comes in like, now I'm have the opportunity to grow it and introduce people to what this is all about. This is our natural. We have the blend of all the colors coming off the goats. And you saw that there was a black goat, but you never get black cashmere. Cream is ideal. Most companies will want cream because of how you can dye on it. And then you get browns and tans and then you get a grayish or a brownish off of a guy like this. So this is the blend. And then we dye on top of this. So you always can see, a real earthiness in the color. And you can even, see the brown, the natural come through. Or in a different color. We have 2 weights of yarn. This is our 6-ply RDK, and then our fingering. So yeah, that's what we do.
So if somebody is curious about working with cashmere yarn and they haven't yet, is there anything that you would tell them?
I can't speak for other cashmeres, but what I can say about our cashmere is that early on we had people say, this isn't cashmere. It's not cashmere as they're used to. And then I had a colleague in my local Weavers Guild who showed up at my door with an article from 1986 Spinoff magazine. And it was an article on the very first international conference on cashmere. And it said in there that the North American market wanted a cashmere that's very inexpensive and they respond to the touch. So there's only 2 ways you get that, right? Inexpensive is, then it's, I don't know what it is. And that you respond to the touch means then you do things to prematurely bring out the softness. So then I did more research and I found people being quoted in articles about saying who work with cashmere all the time and say, highest quality cashmere isn't that soft. So it's not that it's not soft. You're going to have a wonderful soft experience. And then when you wash the first time, when your garment's done, you're going to see this beautiful bloom. It's not soft like some department store sweater that's been, bloomed so that you respond to this, a lot of halo. Yeah. That's not going to happen. Often if you can't wear wool, you can wear cashmere because it's a smooth and hollow fiber. And so being a hollow fiber, it's very lightweight. So you can have a very, very warm garment that is incredibly lightweight. I think the goat tells us something that if the goat only produces 4 ounces, you don't need a lot of this cashmere to get a lot of warmth. But cashmere also has the property of sort of regulating with your body temperature. So it can be something that you might even be able, probably not the hottest days, but certainly have and take into the air conditioning or something.
Oh, that's great.
And then the allergen part is a wool fiber has all these little barbs and that helps it to felt. Well, so because this is a smooth rod, you get that softness next to your skin. Wool has lanolin and some people can have a negative response to the lanolin. Goat's fiber doesn't have cashmere doesn't have lanolin. Goats don't have.
Oh, that's great. So there
are
multiple,
those things. So
multiple reasons.
What I would say to a new knitter is don't be afraid. You can knit and unknit and reknit with this. I like to tell, sometimes hear, I'm not good enough for cashmere. I think you probably are.
Yeah.
I mean, if I could call it a bit of a workhorse, I'm new at designing and believe me, I knit and unknit and reknit and it holds up. And I think you will find that you just have something that is very joyful to work with. And I really am a believer in sort of a slow fashion movement. We use those words, fast fashion, that's throwaway and quick. And I really do believe we need to, for our souls, for our earth, for so many reasons, participate in something that will last.
There's this ongoing discussion within the community of really good yarn that is produced well, where everybody throughout the entire process is getting a fair wage, is not going to be inexpensive. Right. However, there are people who just
Can't
can't
afford it.
go out and drop that much money on a sweater's worth of yarn.
Right.
I don't know. I feel like the era of Instagram has pushed us to make so that we have new
Uh-huh.
things to post and we
I
get
know.
that, dopamine hit when people like
Yep.
what we're doing. And I think that this is a really good example of taking a moment to pause and saying, okay, maybe I want to make my very first cashmere sweater or a shawl or whatever it is
Or
that you want to do.
a
A
one skein
scarf.
little
Yeah.
scarf.
Yeah.
And I feel that pressure in like, oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh, I have to produce more patterns. Oh my gosh, get more patterns, get more designers and do this. And oh my gosh, what is the new thing? And I refuse. I do a weekly newsletter and I really try to bring information or
Mm-hmm.
inspiration. And, certainly at time, yeah, every season there will be some new things, but yeah,
Yeah.
I just can't, I physically and mentally can't participate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it all goes back to capitalism. So
It does. Which I
let's
have to
stand
tell you,
against it and not knit every new thing that comes out. No.
which I have to tell you feels like a conflict because you have to
Yeah.
sell yarn to stay in business.
I know. It really
It's
is.
like,
It's like you have to sell yarn, designers have to sell patterns, but
yeah,
then there's this thing that we do is made to be slow. It's made to be
yes, yes,
a lot of people that, I know do this for mental health reasons. Like we're not
yes,
powering through and
right,
but then on the other side it's like, well, we got to make money, you got to sell the things.
yeah,
And so you got to keep going and going and going and yeah,
yeah.
it's
But I kind
oh,
of am falling on. There are a lot of people out there, so
mhm.
um,
Yeah.
let's focus on that.
Yeah. Yeah. For
And
sure.
everybody, if everybody, does their little part,
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be mass consumption. By the way, we're called June Cashmere. Remember I said
Mhm.
there wasn't use of cashmere and there wasn't even a word for
Oh,
cashmere.
right. I read this. I'm
Yeah.
excited that you're bringing this up because I meant to ask about it, but yes, please go
So
ahead.
we're called, I'm not June, but
Right.
I get
Yeah.
called Denise. We're called June Cashmere because June is a word that sounds the same as the Kyrgyz word, meaning animal fiber.
Mhm.
And then our June month kind of wraps up that springtime when the fiber naturally molts off and 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 is collected, combed and collected. And so it sort of wraps up harvest time. And so Sai, the founder, said June Cashmere. Carol and Sabir did in 2021 went back out to some of these towns to ask, okay, how do you like this program? Is it working for you? Are you satisfied? Um, and they were getting overwhelmingly that this is an income, a secondary income that comes in the springtime, which is kind of, they're getting ready to go back up in the mountains or to plant their crops again. And women and children often do the combing. So like the whole family's involved. And what they found when they went back to the villages was just really, Carol recounted stories to me of what people do with the income. And so like a young boy with his share bought himself what we would call a soccer uniform and soccer ball.
Oh, I love
Or a
it.
woman paid for, I think it was can't remember if it was a school entrance exam or something like that. They might buy another animal. It's something to help subsidize and on a larger scale than working with more families and making Kyrgyzstan known as a premier cashmere producer. So ultimately, I think that's the goal.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing this.
Yes, thank you.
I love a good history lesson, especially when
I
it
do.
comes to like the thing that we love to do. If people want to know more about the history, the textile history, about your brand, etc., where can they find you?
JuneCashmere.com. There are several blog posts.
Great.
There's an about us, and there's some lovely videos. And join our newsletter because I try to continually share some things.
Love it. Thank you so much. Of course, now my dog is
You,
barking.
yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
We made it. We made
We
it,
made
and
it.
now Benny is like, okay, it's time. We
Had
gotta
enough.
go on a walk.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you,
inviting.
Amy. Oh my gosh. I mean, how much did you just learn right now? That's so amazing. Amy, I loved the history lesson. I mean, pulling out that map, of course. Now we're going to chat with Rachel. You've probably seen Rachel on the internets at some point. Rachel was the person who knit her own wedding dress during the pandemic. She walks us through that whole process, and I ask a few questions about it at the end. Rachel is also the mastermind behind ZZ Textiles, and it's some beautiful yarn. So go check that out as well. But let's hear about maybe one of the biggest overachievers I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. I mean, this is like one of the most impressive things I've ever heard.
That's
knitting
so
your own
kind.
wedding dress.
Thank you so much.
Are you an overachiever? No.
Yes. I don't know when to stop either. I don't know when to put things down.
Oh my gosh, the story of my life. Okay, so before we talk about knitting your own wedding dress, what is your maker journey? Where did everything begin?
When I was 10, my mom taught me to knit. I think it's kind of a hazy memory, but I think it was over the summer when we were in like home for school or home for the summer when school was out, and we were bored and it was probably bad weather and she needed to keep us entertained. And so she taught me and my sister to knit and to crochet. And like most kids, it took like a couple tries to get it right because I'm very impatient and excitable. But it eventually stuck. And so all through middle school and high school, I was knitting and crocheting. I was the only kid in our school who was doing that. So I did not have a lot of friends who were interested in the same things. And when Ravelry came around in 2007, I was actually a beta tester. Which I also don't think there are very many people my age doing that. But it was so exciting because it was the first time I realized that there was this whole universe of makers out there. And I think it kind of launched this, like, I just, some of the online identity I think a lot of us have with crafting and the relationships within the community that we've created. So that had always been kind of my happy space. And then after high school, I went to University of Cincinnati and studied fashion design there with a focus in knitwear. And I actually didn't realize that I wanted to do knitwear until like midway through school. It just had not occurred to me that sweaters were made outside of just like in your house. I just didn't understand how that works. No one had ever shown it to me before, that the industrial world of knitwear was so foreign to me. And so midway through school, I had a kind of an aha moment when we had our knitwear class, learned to use knitting machines. That sort of took off like a freight train, and I became absolutely obsessed. And then after school, I worked as a knitwear designer for Abercrombie for about 10 years. So getting a lot of like hands-on industry experience, which was amazing. That was during the time that I started knitting my dress, kind of at the tail end of that. I got engaged in, I'm probably jumping the gun here, but I got engaged in 2019, early 2019. We were supposed to get married in 2020, but then, this big thing happened.
Yeah.
That we're all very familiar with. So we actually pushed the wedding to 2022. We had to reschedule it twice. I started the dress right before lockdown and had a lot of time to work on it. But that's sort of the whole trajectory.
I feel like a lot of people have seen it floating around the internet because impressive, so impressive. Yeah. I need to know everything. How many skeins, how long, did it take? Like, where did you start with the design? Like, I guess just, word vomit everything out to us right now, because I'm so curious.
Let's do it. Oh, let's see. So the whole idea came from my mom made her wedding dress. My grandmas, both of my grandparents or grandmothers made their wedding dresses. And then I can only assume from there forward, because you're getting into like the early 1900s and things, that everyone else was also making their dresses. And so I kind of felt like, all right, I'm a fashion designer. Everyone in my family made their dresses. I feel like this is sort of expected of me. I feel like
you kind of have to, huh?
Like no pressure or anything. But I'm not a sewer. I mean, I can. I've learned how to, but it's not my comfort zone. And I was like, well, what would my twist be? I guess knitting my dress would be a pretty cool twist. And I feel like I had always had like a rough idea of what kind of silhouette I wanted. It was always sort of something a little plungy, with a little bit of like a body skimming shape, and then like a big big open train in the back. But over the years throughout school, it had started off being like an actual wedding gown. And then as I got interested in knitwear, it sort of started evolving into a knit garment. And I decided to track the whole thing on Instagram, because when I would tell people like, oh, I'm going to knit my wedding dress now that I'm engaged, I would get like a couple different responses. And some people would be like, oh, okay, all right. Like they couldn't picture it. Or you would get kind of like a horrified, like, like as they're picturing like a table sweater. And you're like, no. It's not going to be like a grandpa sweater that's like white. It's going to be a dress. It's not going to look like a dress. And since I wouldn't be taking like my mom and sister on like the usual trying on journey, I thought it'd be kind of cool to like give everybody like a little behind the scenes glimpse into everything. And so it started, swatching. So I always knew it was going to be some kind of mohair silk blend, because I love that blend of yarn. I love like the sheen, and then the drape of the silk is amazing. And then that like fluffy, gauzy little halo. I just love that so much. So I always knew it was going to be something like that. So I had bought maybe like 7 or 8 different kid silk blends and swatched every single one of them and just like a generic lace pattern, just to see what would happen. And the one that I ended up landing on was just classic drops kid silk, just a good old workhorse of a yarn. It's beautiful and it's affordable. So that was our winner. And I started off just doing some like rough sketches. I started doing a bunch of research on Ravelry and just looking through like all the component sections and stitch libraries and things. And I found a dress called Acacia. Her dress basically had this gorgeous stitch pattern that was exactly what I was looking for. It's an Estonian lace pattern. And then it had a hem stitch that was also very beautiful. Kind of had like a laddered lace visual. And I emailed her once the project started taking off, just to like let her know, like, hey, I'm using your stitch that I'm sure came from a stitch dictionary. I just can't find it because it's in another language, but I just want to make sure you're okay with this. So she did give me permission to like, share everything. That became the stitch pattern that I wanted to use for the fabric of the skirt. And then, so I swatched that. And then the big mystery question of like, well, now what? Like, I've got this swatch. I guess I have to start at some point. And I had actually started with the bodice first. I thought I wanted to do just like a very basic kind of bateau neck, like slash in the back with a little button, stockinette top that would like blouson a little bit into a skirt that would start as like a body skimming fit from like the natural waist down. So I actually knit an entire top first and then left it on scrap yarn and was like, okay, now we're going to start the skirt and then we'll just graft them together when the time comes. So just put that on ice for a moment.
Got it. Yeah.
So then then the tricky part of figuring out how to start the skirt began. So I cast on with like a provisional cast on and just measured, based off of my swatch and how I wanted it to fit my waist, like pretty much exactly. And I went a little wider than my waist just so that it would skim down my widest point at my hips without any complicated increasing or decreasing inside of a lace pattern, which I was trying to avoid as much as possible. I didn't figure that out myself. So I worked on that for a while and knit that straight until it got to the point in the back of the skirt where there would be a godet for the beginning of the train, which presented with like huge problem number 2, which is how the heck do you make a train in a knit dress without seaming? And I was very adamant about not having seams in it. I know seams can add structural points and they can give it some strength, but I really wanted this to be seamless because I knew as it would sit on my body, I'm tall, it's going to be hanging for a long time off of me on this day. I didn't want drag lines in between the seams. I didn't want interruptions in the seams. I didn't want the seams to pucker. So I knew the thing is going to be seamless. We just have to figure this out. So I started playing around with swatching for this because I essentially wanted it to just, open up really nicely and neatly and widen into this big thing. And that would basically create the opening that would, like, you can kind of think of a train like a high-low hem with a triangle wedge inserted into the circle, and that's all it is. That's as complicated as it is. But figuring out how to do that was quite a treat. I eventually got to the point where I was like, this is not working, and I need to find either a stitch that naturally increases at the rate that I want, or I just need to put a seam in this thing and figure it out later. And I was searching on Ravelry and just trying to look for stitches again that I could insert into this. And all of a sudden I realized I could just insert a wedge of a shawl in there that increased on both sides. And all of a sudden you've got your semicircle. It was
my
like
gosh.
the biggest. It's like, I can't believe it. Like, it took me like months to figure this out, but that's just how it happens.
I mean,
you're just like workshopping.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The look on my face was probably, yeah, like, oh, duh.
Yeah. You're like, duh now, you know? But I found,
because I'm like sitting here like, ooh, how's this going to play out? I'm like, I wish I had popcorn, just like, you know, and yeah. Okay. Got it. So
I found
shawl.
And the shawl pattern whose stitch I use is called Illumine. And it's basically a semicircle shawl of 12 wedges, and each wedge naturally grows. And so I took 3 wedges and put that into the Godet, and it worked perfectly after a lot of frogging mohair to get there. And
which is so fun. We love frogging.
So awful. And after like the 10th time frogging mohair, I'm like, all right, I'm just going to cut this thing and like put it back on the needles. I became a little bit known on Instagram for just cavalierly cutting the dress in half whenever I would make a mistake, which I kept telling people, I'm like, it's just yarn. It's just string. Like, you can always reknit it once you kind of go backwards. But I eventually started putting lifelines in, but I always do an afterthought lifeline rather than putting them, you know, along the way. But it worked. It always worked out. After the Godet was finished, it got nice and wide at the bottom. And then this is when I had to figure out the high-low hem component. So I started to do Japanese short rows around it so that I was just increasing the length of the back, which was quite the process because this was also all happening in lace. But at this point, it's like down at the hem. If there is a resolved stitch that isn't quite perfectly in pattern, no one's going to see it. So I had to keep reminding myself of that too. Like, this is made by a human. It's okay if it's not, you know, every single repeat isn't literally perfect looking. And then from there, it was just adding that like laddered kind of stitch hem, which was about, I want to say I made it about like 11 inches. It's about 11 to 12 inches, like a foot along the hem. And that stitch also came from the acacia dress. And then the skirt was done. And then the pin that we put in the top was that so much time had elapsed at this point that I went back and looked at that and I was like, what is this? What is this like 40 stockinette thing that I think I'm going to attach to this Estonian lace skirt, and it is not going to look remotely related to the dress at all. So that's when going back to the drawing board kind of happened for the top and figuring out what I wanted it to look like. Right around this time is when COVID lockdown started. So I had finished the skirt by this time, and I was like working on figuring out what I wanted the top to look like. And this is when we also started figuring out, like, we're going to have to push out this wedding. I'd still had a couple months left to finish the top and figure out what was going on underneath. As someone who is a bit of a workaholic and has a lot of ideas, giving me an undisclosed amount of time to figure out what I wanted the top to look like meant I knit 4 tops because I just couldn't make up my mind. And it was like too much time to work on something. There was no deadline in sight anymore. So that first top got scrapped, and then I tried working on something that was like very constructed and had a lot of seams and picked up stitches, just to try to keep everything from sagging. Because that was the other challenge I started to run into. Like, the skirt wasn't necessarily heavy, but considering that the top would be made of the same really lightweight material, it was going to be like pulling, like whatever those little straps were doing, which I wanted delicate little straps, they were going to be working real hard the whole wedding. Yeah. And so I started to get a little worried about that. And eventually that design also got scrapped. It was just getting a little too complicated. And I landed on just doing like a really simple all over lace plunge with the low back. It's just a good old Elizabeth Zimmerman stitch called Crystal Chandelier, which felt really appropriate because it also feels very Art Deco-y 1920s, and I was wearing like crystal chandelier earrings, and I had already bought the earrings at that point. And I was like, oh, this was meant to be. It was meant to finally be that stitch after like 10 different tops. This was the point where I'm starting to realize I need to find something to go underneath the dress because it's see-through.
Yeah.
And when I first had started this whole process, I had thought I was going to knit or sew a slip dress that would go underneath, and I would then match the knit shell to the shape underneath. But that proved to be overly complicated. It made a lot more sense to just knit the dream dress and then figure out the undergarments later. And again, my sewing skills are not great. So everything was turning out a little like rough drafty looking for a wedding dress. So I started realizing I would have to figure out where to purchase something to go underneath. And at this point, the shape of the dress was pretty much made and established, and there was no way I was going to find something that was the exact same shape. So I ended up buying a shapewear bodysuit that became the foundation for the top, and the top got sewn into that. So it literally, all of a sudden now, all the weight of the dress was being held up by this bodysuit. So that worked out perfectly. And then I bought a silk nude, the bodysuit was nude, a silk nude slip skirt that was floor length on Etsy. It ended up being one of those that they can customize it to whatever length that you need. And so I told them the measurements I needed. They made it exactly how I needed. And then that would go on top of the bodysuit, and then the dress would go on top of all of that. And it worked out perfectly. And then, and then I wove in all the horrible little mohair ends. The rest is history.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
I'm like, how many ends did you have to weave in?
It was a lot. Honestly, weaving in mohair ends was kind of like a piece of cake because it just like sticks to itself. It just Velcros to itself. So you just kind of like weasel it in there and literally never see it again.
I mean, at that point, I probably would have been like, all right, who hasn't purchased a gift for me that wants to come help me weave in these ends? Because I'm done. Like,
the steam block this for me.
Yeah. Who wants to do the finishing? Because it's not me.
I'm done.
Was there anything that you learned that you were like surprised to learn while you were doing this?
I think I was surprised by the problem solving because I really did go into this with not much of a plan. And I think a lot of people think I had a big plan. Like I had not even designed the skirt by the time I cast on the skirt. You know, like it was like, here's a swatch of this, here's a swatch of that. Let's just knit to the part where it splits open. And that's like, 2 months from now, Rachel's problem. But today Rachel has just straight knitting to do. And the entire thing was honestly very much like that. So I think I was surprised that I was comfortable with that process, I guess. But I also think that's kind of the only way to do something like that. Like sometimes having a plan, it's all going to unravel really quickly and then you'll get discouraged. I was also, and this I think surprised a lot of people too, very cavalier with the scissors and the red wine while I was working on this. And it was like, I would just knit at night and I would be, have my coffee, my red wine. Nick would be my husband, would be like, what the heck are you doing? Like if you spill on that, it's ruined.
Were there any spills?
No, not a single one, shockingly, which my nickname is No Spill Rachel out of irony. I am a spiller. Maybe that's what I was most impressed by, the fact that I didn't spill on this.
Yeah. If it was me, that dress would not be white.
It would have been a funny little shade of pink.
That's so funny.
But no, honestly, I think the thing I was most surprised by was actually how much interest was taken in it. Because I like I had said at the beginning, I had started the account mostly to share with friends and family or people who were like, what the heck does a knit wedding dress look like? I knew that like there would be people interested, but I did not expect as many people to take interest in it and to follow the entire process from start to finish. So that really surprised me.
So I think that one of the things that I really enjoy about knitting is not only obviously like this finished product or, the benefits, mental health benefits, etc., but the fact that like I can take certain projects with me certain places and have like fun memories of like crafting in public or with people. Do you have any specific memories while creating that are kind of like that? And is it like you look at like this part of the skirt and you remember it, or is it?
Oh yes. Oh yes. I love that you said that. Very much so. I feel like I can picture all the nights that I would be sitting on the sofa working on this while I was still wad upable in my lap and very small. And just to clarify, because I mentioned earlier that my husband was like, don't spill on that. He saw me work on it maybe like a handful of times when it still was kind of cobwebby and like no idea of what it could be. So he did not actually like see what the dress looked like, but I can literally picture those.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that part. This is.
I don't think anyone would have known what they were looking at, based on fluffy pile, but yeah, I can vividly remember all of those nights and like laying it on the floor and like cutting it. I can remember every single one of those cuts and putting it on my dress form in my office. And I mean, a lot of those memories I feel like are kind of funny little dark evenings because it was winter, it was dark outside. I would always have to work on it in the evenings after work or in like an office or a spare bedroom so that no one could see it, to keep it a secret. And watching a lot of like true crime documentaries.
I was gonna say, what were you listening to anything? Were you watching? What was your go-to during that time?
Oh boy. I watched a lot of like Netflix true crime. God, I can't even remember.
There was a lot of that pumped out during the pandemic too. Like,
yes, there was. I probably
dang, they've had this on ice, haven't they? Just waiting for us to not have anything else to do. Was there ever a moment that you were like, why am I doing this? I don't want to be doing this anymore. I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yes. Oh God, yes. When I had finished the skirt, before I had started on the top, I had taken my dress down to my parents' house in Cincinnati. My mom has a really nice sewing machine, and the plan was for me to take everything down there for like a nice long weekend, and I could spread everything out on the table and work on it and have it out in the open without my husband seeing it. And this was when I had still had plans to sew a slip that would go underneath the full dress. So I had sewn a skirt that matched the shape, and then I needed to sew a bodice. So I had my sewn skirt on my dress form, the knit thing over the top of it. Super happy, looked amazing. Everything about this top just looked terrible. It looked unprofessional. It did not fit me. Every tweak I made just made it worse. I couldn't figure it out because I just don't have the skills, frankly. And I had bought like several patterns and was trying to like tweak them to fit my body. And I just wasn't doing it well because I just, again, didn't have the skill set. And I just remember getting so upset about it. And like, I went back to like the guest bedroom that night and I'm just on my laptop watching something or, texting my husband and telling him about this, like, the despairs of trying to figure this out. And I get into my head, like, I'm never going to figure out this top. I went online and I literally was putting wedding dresses in my shopping cart. But at this point, this was before we had delayed the wedding. So this was pre-COVID. I only had about like maybe 3 months left. And you can't buy anything like ready to ship in the wedding world in 3 months. I mean, it might have been even less time than that. And then if it didn't fit well, then I paused on this big project and didn't finish it. And then now I have this expensive dress that doesn't fit me. So I definitely remember just kind of feeling like I wasn't ever going to get there. And then I woke up the next morning and I told my mom, like, I'm just going to buy a dress. And she looked at me like I had 14 heads and was like, no, you're not. You are going to figure this out. I'm sorry. You are not buying a dress. So it kind of brought me down to earth.
Like, okay, let's really look at this and how much time you put into it.
Like, you had one bad sewing day. Let's move on. It didn't get snowed on the day of, believe it or not. It survived.
Oh my God. I would just be like, okay, now I'm going to enter this plastic bubble that will be around me the entire wedding. Nobody touch me. Yeah. I'm just gonna.
That was a little scary, but yeah, it all worked out.
Yeah. But also probably at that point you were like, you know what? It does not matter. It does not matter.
No.
Because we just need to get married.
Yep.
You're like,
Yeah,
I'm just gonna wear the dress. It does not matter what happens. We've postponed this. If your wedding dress could tell the story of its creation, what do you think it would say about the journey from like the first stitch to the final fitting?
Oh my goodness. I think it would say just go with the flow, because you never know what's going to happen. That's very much how the design process was treated, and we had to go with the flow of the world around us because no one predicted that the pandemic was coming. It was also kind of a good grounding piece of like, hey, you can't control what's going on, so just keep knitting, just do another row. It's going to be fine. It's just string. Like, you'll figure this out. And we did. Everything worked out. And in the moment, it doesn't always seem like that. But it definitely was a lesson in patience and just kind of letting the pieces fall.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been super fun. If they're not already following you on Instagram, where can they find you?
The wedding dress account is called Married in a Sweater. You can also find me at ZZ Textiles, which is where my yarn dyeing business is. The wedding account, it's an archive at this point. And then you can also find me at zztextiles.com, which is where my yarn is. And that will get you in touch with me if you want to.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about ZZ Textiles.
Oh, yeah. So that was also a pandemic project. I was working from home.
Perfect. An overachiever to the T.
I'm busy. I will go crazy if I don't stay busy. I was working from home during the pandemic. I was still at Abercrombie at this point. And I was really missing the tactile aspects of my job and needing to like touch yarn and see colors with my eyes, like actually in front of me. And as a bit of an obsessive textile hobby collector with like spinning and weaving and, everything that you can do, dyeing was the one thing I hadn't learned yet. So I decided to play around with it. And the first summer it was horrible. I dyed what we lovingly refer to as clown yarn, and it was really ugly. And I threw it away and I gave up and I said, I'm never doing this again. And then the next summer I got bored and played with it again. And it stuck this time. That's all based off of capturing nostalgia visually. So I'm very inspired by the way we all connect to our own stories or each other's stories or these moments in time. But it's really hard to have someone else see it the same way that you can see it. And even though me dyeing a memory on yarn and showing it to you, you might still not see it the same way that I do. That's just sort of an impossible, intangible thing. You're still going to have an emotional reaction to color, and it'll create this new emotional response. And then you kind of take that with you. And I think that's kind of abstractly beautiful. So it's very much inspired by that concept.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And
Thank you for talking to me.
If you enjoyed this episode, I would so appreciate you telling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more of your maker friends about Making Conversation. We've got some really amazing episodes coming up. So make sure that you're subscribed. Tell all of your friends. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you next time.